And we're recording. I want you to imagine that you have a ball, okay? Balls have mass. The bigger the ball, the bigger the mass. The smaller the ball, the smaller the mass. There's this thing called flat space. Imagine it's a bit like a net. Once you put the ball into the net, it naturally kind of warps around it. Bigger the mass, bigger the warp. Smaller the mass, smaller the warp. Now let's say that you've got a particle that wants to travel across the flat space, but it's moving incredibly slowly. It probably won't reach its destination because it will fall into the warp. Now let's say that mass is spinning. Mass will naturally drag space. Space also drags mass. If you have a lot of mass in a relatively small area, it creates a black hole. A black hole has such a large warp that not even light will be able to escape it. The centre of a black hole is called a singularity.
That's really interesting. However, I've actually been looking at something like knots. I think knots are quite interesting. Like, for example, what is a knot? So when you get this string and you tie it together with that, the two ends of the string, you tie that together and that is the knot. Now, in maths, you have knots which are very similar, except that they don't have the two ends. Now there are 4 very basic knots in maths, but these are very special knots because you can't see them and you can't touch them. However, we have to work out how we can make it back into the piece of string. However, we can't make it back into the piece of string because they are what are known as unknots. Now an unknot is a closed loop. It's something which has no end or beginning. So just to go over everything. A knot is when you tie a piece of string, that is the knot. An unknot is a closed loop. It doesn't have an end or a beginning. It's kind of like an Ouroboros, really. Now what we have to do as mathematicians is we have to work out how to get and untangle these knots. Now we have to also work out how, if it's an actual knot or a trivial knot. Now, a trivial knot is where we can use a specific set of rules to untangle this knot and turn it back into an unknot. But if it's an actual knot, we realise that this is something that we can't untangle.
You talking about trivia kind of pushes the thought. We've talked about science and scientific theory, but what happens when conspiracy plays a part? For example, the conspiracy of the tree of life, right? It's this thing called the tree of life, and it's been around for far longer than humans have. And once a baby is born, the tree of life will give it a soul. See, the problem is that souls have mass. Bigger the soul, bigger the mass. Smaller the soul, smaller the mass. And there's also this thing called flat space. Imagine it's a bit like the tree. Once you put the soul into the tree, it creates a warp naturally. And what I'm telling you is complete rubbish. But basically, imagine if you've got a person and they want to move from point A to point B, but they're moving really slowly. Know that they won't be able to do that because they will just go into the tree, into the warp. They don't have a soul, right? The centre of a soul is called a singularity.
It's kind of like a pseudoscience, really, because it doesn't kind of have to make any sense, but I mean, as long as people believe in it, and that's what matters. I mean, speaking of not believing in anything, have you heard about the Earth being completely round? Or is it? Obviously we know it's completely round, but there's a section of people who do believe this. But according to Samuel Rowbotham, based on the Bedford Level experiment, the Earth is a complete flat disk surrounded by a wall of ice, the centre of the disk being the North Pole. Now, there are 2 views that remain clear within this community. The Earth is completely flat, and there is no such thing as outer space. No one has ever travelled there. But, I hear you ask, how come we don't fall off the edge? Well, what happens when you get to the edge of the disk is the Pac-Man effect takes place. Yes, the Pac-Man effect. And what this is like the game Pac-Man, when Pac-Man travels from one edge of the screen to the other. Once it reaches the edge of the other screen, it teleports to the other side. But what would happen if a knot was involved as Pac-Man was teleporting? What if Pac-Man was teleporting and that interstitial point where they're not met the North Pole centre, how do we begin to untangle this? But what if that interstitial point where they meet, what if that formed a black hole? And if Pac-Man wants to teleport over that, how would we mark that altogether?
See, I've been trying to understand science recently.
The Earth is
You have this thing
completely
called the
round.
tree of life, right?
Or is it? According to Samuel
been around
Rowbotham,
for
based on the
so
method
much
level
longer than humans
experiment,
have.
the Earth is a complete flat disc surrounded by a wall of
Basically,
ice, with its
when
very
humans born,
centre being the
it's
North
given a
Pole.
soul.
Now, two views remain true in this
Souls have
community.
mass.
The Earth is
Bigger the soul,
completely
bigger the
flat,
mass.
and then there's no such thing as outer space. No
There's
one
also this
can
thing called
travel
flat
there.
space. Imagine it's a bit like
What
a
happens?
tree.
You don't fall off the edge, I hear.
And if you put a soul
Well,
into the tree, it will
apparently
naturally
what happens
walk, won't
with
it?
the edge of the disc
And what I'm telling you is
Pac-Man
complete
takes
rubbish.
place. And what this means
But
is that when Pac-Man travels from one end
imagine
of the
you've
screen
got a
to the
person
other,
that's
Pac-Man
travelling from A
travels
to
to
B,
the other
right?
side. So
No,
basically,
they
what
won't,
happens
because
is
they're not
Pac-Man
moving
travels over
fast
to the other
enough,
side
and
where
they'll
they're
just
not
fall into the tree.
And what is the
No,
what
they
is
don't
the
have a
soul
soul.
when they're not at the North Pole?
See,
How would
the
Pac-Man
centre of
travel
the
over
soul
this? How would
is
Pac-Man
the
decide?
singularity.
How do we diagnose and how do we measure? How
I've been
to
trying to figure out
diagnose
science.
it? I mean, of course, none of this is true at all, but
Okay.
I think it's about appreciating the little things, taking that one step at a time.
I'm really trying to do the right thing here. I'm thinking, I'm breathing.
It might be the big things that we remember, but it's the little everyday actions.
I am capable of consciousness.
Gravity.